stick around for the report out session because this is going to directly follow into the group collectively benefiting from what you've all been working on for the last hour. Okay, are we wrapping up? Okay. So thank you all for your engaged and thoughtful dialogue over the last hour. As we're all frantically trying to reposition flip charts. And now comes the best part, because now we're going to be able to hear collectively what we've all been working on for the last little bit. So we're going to go around the room. Each facilitator is going to report back on the experience of that table and some of the lessons and observations and those sorts of things. So about 3 minutes per facilitator, and 3.5, and then we're going to try and wrap it up at the end and then move into our public comment period. Fair enough? Take it away, Bill.
Thank you. Thank you. So the group that I worked in the back of the room, good participation, and they identified about 9 or 10 things, and then they combined some of them. So we got it down to 4. You'll really only see 3 of them up here at the moment. The first one is all about the community itself. The community or the county as appropriate. And there's 2 aspects here, really. First of all, the community needs to be aware. They need to be fully educated and aware of what's going on here. You know, what are the risks? And educated, what's happened in the past. That could include their awareness of other things nuclear, whether it's production, storage, use, and power plants. And they want some assurance that there will be progress towards not only getting the approval for the site, but the ongoing maintenance and management of that site. So a big focus on the community, the county itself. Secondly, is the consent-based siting process must be site-specific. It cannot be one size fits all. So it should be a site-specific process. All sorts of areas to take into account. For instance, what is their awareness or education? What facilities are already there or in the area? What opportunities might be unique? R&D, development, economics, fuel conversion. What is the experience, again, in the other areas of nuclear, all things nuclear, my group like to call it, and what are the jurisdictional issues, if any? What are the politics, if any? What is the stability to stick with and execute that plan? So site-specific. The third area boils down to trust. Boils down to trust. And here's where the group talked about, it's not just consent, it's earned consent. It's not assumed consent. You can't take an area and say, they're going to approve this no matter what. So earn that consent, prove it, and then have trust that DOE will stick to the plan. And they said, and maybe not DOE, maybe this might be an area where it might need to be an independent agency that's somehow related yet independent from DOE that will implement this. So trust became a big aspect. The fourth one, they liked how it connected the dots. opportunity. So in this area, so once you put a site or consider a site and maintain that site for perpetuity, this opens up all sorts of opportunities, and this should be included in the consent-based siting process. So that opportunities could be, if you have a site here, here's the good things that might happen. One of the ones they brought up, in addition to R&D and fuel conversion, was for the university of that area to become a center of excellence, and to roll that out for the benefit of the community. So they really saw opportunities, and not just the technical aspect should be included in the site-based process. There were a few other areas that they did touch on. They got really specific. These will be in the typed report, but boiled down to those four: focus on a community, focus on what's very site-specific for the community, trust with DOE or the agency, and finally the opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. I'm Janice, and we had a very lively discussion at our group. We came up with one of the most important issues being a bottom-up grassroots approach. So in that spirit, our chart is bottom-up. So we have overarching issues such as the benefits, responsibilities, timeliness, and ownership. Then we thought completely defining the issue was the next most important piece, framing the challenge so it's understood by local citizens. Third, we thought most important was the effective process design, building on proven models, oversight and accountability models such as NEPA, and making sure those are workable and effective in the process design. Lastly, we came up with meaningful community engagement and education, the process driven by a broad group of stakeholders, not by industry, but including industry, and full integration of communities and understanding how are community boundaries defined.
Hello, I'm Frank. Thank you. Very good. We had a very lively discussion at this table. We came up with 3 of the excuse me, top considerations. Sorry, I have a little bit of a sore throat. The first is establishing technical criteria and standards for interim storage and deep geological site, and it must be in parallel with the consent-based siting process. The second is establishing an independent, separately funded organization for nuclear waste. Yes, so that's number 2. And 3, this was really short. They said funding just needs to be fixed. That means what will the funds be used for, how will they be tracked, and so on and so forth. So, thank you.
Hi, we had a good discussion as well with lots of differing opinions, and these are the 4 ideas they asked me to share in no particular order. But the first one is the ability to create enforceable agreements at the local, the regional, and the state levels. And this one actually came up at several different points. It just kept coming back to we need enforceable agreements at all these levels. The second one is that the process and the criteria may be different for repository versus consolidated interim storage. So some thought needs to be put into what those processes would be, and they may look very different for the different types of storage. The third one is that the DOE needs to provide more parameters before a group receives money, that's a $, to ensure its serious considerations. So the thought here was that before money's put out for the step 1 process, that there may be some communities that are eager to receive the funding for that, but may not necessarily be seriously ready to take it to level 2. So really kind of thinking through and vetting through to ensure that people or communities that are in the step 1 process are very serious about moving forward and finding out more. And then the fourth one was that the DOE and the industry needs to show that they are trustworthy and come up with a believable consent-based process. So there was a lot of conversation around past history and changes, and sometimes it being political environment changes and administration changes, and just things that have happened in the past to create a sense or a lack of trust with some people. And the idea of involving people at all levels and differing points of view and conversations like this to kind of help support that so people do feel more trustworthy and that they can support the process. Thank you.
we discussed a lot of issues, and I don't know if we reached too much agreement, but I guess I'll start with this quote: "Say what you do and do what you say." And that's connected to the point that our table felt that there should be a new organization to implement this process, that notwithstanding the great efforts that DOE is doing now, that there's a lot of mistrust with DOE, and the simplest thing would be to have a new organization, okay, at some point. Secondly, there was a lot of skepticism about whether there was a real commitment here to developing a process. One word that was used as maybe, or a term was, maybe I'm too jaded at this point to believe that that some type of effective process is going to come out of this effort. That's tied into people around the table saying we need a broader process that involves more involvement of communities, more involvement of average citizens. We couldn't really come up with any specifics about how you would do that process, but I think there was a belief, and I'm looking at my colleagues here, that there was a belief that some type of additional process would be needed, some type of collaborative process. Someone raised the example of how they developed the healthcare system in California. And a lot of you may be gasping and fainting over that. I don't know anything about how they developed the healthcare system in California, but there was somehow a feeling that there needed to be a broader involvement. Related to that, I think, was we're spending all this effort on developing a process to look for volunteers, if that's the right way to say it. There are two efforts now, one in Texas, waste control specialist, who's coming in to the NRC with a license application for a interim storage facility. Eddy Lee County over in New Mexico plans to do the same thing. Are we really squandering the opportunities by not focusing on those two sites and doing all that we can to try to promote that? And we started out with using the term, we should look at all liabilities, which people defined as all the risks, negative impacts, and then broadened out to benefits. That has to be done. Communities have to be involved, and we had the good professor at the table, and he raised the point that you have a problem here where the benefits of this are widely distributed across the society, but the costs are really focused on a few places. So how do you try to get that involved with the process? So we went a lot of places, and we're still on the bus, I guess, so that was our conversation.
All right, so our table here really, we had a couple dozen different areas of comments, and we refined or boiled this down to 3 areas. Number 1 was education. So they felt that education is really, really important, specifically to the community where the site ends up. Make sure there's a lot of outreach. Make sure that that is proactive education, not just, hey, what do you want to know, but sending out the information. Building a plan, having a communication plan, establish the plan, and execute the plan. Make sure that the education is balanced, so it's all sides, with representation from all sides, so that the people feel like the information they're getting is accurate and it's unbiased. We've got a lot of I's here. So we have this 3I process, and there's actually 2 more. The 3 I's the table came up with are inform, involve, and integrate. So as it relates to the community, inform them, let them know the risks, the benefits, all of the issues, involve them. Make sure that they're part of the process and integrate them as well. So, hey, you're part of the community. We're putting your site here. This is what it means to you. And the other 2 I's were inclusive. Make sure that all the voices get out. Maybe communities of color or where they've not been so inclusive in the past. Make sure that you reach out to those folks and get their opinions and do it with integrity. So there's some issues around maybe a lack of trust, so the integrity will help. The second area was voluntary. Make sure that the community feels that they've not been rushed, they've not been pressured, nor bribed into the process. And they feel like it's their decision, right? So the community where these places land, they got to feel like it's a decision that they own. And the last piece here is it's really about a culture of safety, but we threw science and sustainability in there as well. So making sure that overall feeling that we're watching out for your safety, there's science involved here, we're not just guessing, and that it's a sustainable and long-term solution.
Okay. It's kind of nice going toward the end because we have heard a lot of things that we also talked about. One of the things that we talked about was that the public needs to know. And there's a lot of talk about, we need to communicate the risks and the benefits. We're taking it up a notch. We want people to know when meetings like this happen. We want people to know if there's a town hall, what is the reason, the incentive, the value to them as a homeowner, as a person that works. Why should they go to those meetings? So obviously at those meetings we want them to learn about the risks and the benefits and all of that, but we want it to go even higher. We also felt like there is a problem with trust, and we believe that an independent agency would need to run this process, and that there is a lack of trust at the state and the federal government level, and that we talked about, going back to our younger days, how do you build trust? We talk about how easy it is to go away. How do you build trust? So some of the things we talked about were, trust is built on actions, your track record. Well, a new agency is not going to have a track record, so what are some of the other things that it can be doing? And a lot of it is going back to the local level. Start building trust there, because those are the people that the community knows. May or may not like them, but they know them. So if they've got a track record at home, then you can start building on that as you're working into the agency. There was some concern about, it seems like the decision has been made for the outcome of the process, being pilot, interim storage, permanent repository. And the question is, are we building a process to back into those? And would it be better to consider alternatives? Or would it be, we talked about one alternative, having the interim storage be where the material is currently held. So just a question about, is that something that can be considered? Talk about changes in laws to support this process, as well as the local controls that we talked about earlier. And we had some discussion around environmental justice. And there was talked about earlier, and we talked about it. And one thing that was brought up was to make sure that when we're talking about environmental justice and we're talking about, communities of color or low income, lower education, that we don't reverse this completely and not think about and not even allow those communities to be considered. Because even though we want to be careful with this, and we want to make sure that we're looking at all the different factors, we want to make sure that we don't just go, oh, we don't want to be just looking at these types of communities. We want to make sure that everybody is heard and everybody is considered. And I think that is all.
So for sake of time, I'll just say ditto, and I do our group. So But our group did come up with some similar themes, and I want to quickly let you know what those are. The first thing they said, and to really go what Susan had just articulated, the need, and they really wanted to go on public record of saying this, that the need to establish as quickly as possible a non-DOE entity to perform these tasks. That because there's not a track record with that group, one of the suggestions is that that entity would be doing this, what we're doing today, potentially, of that process. But certainly the execution of that process needs to be done outside of the DOE to accomplish that. And part of what the group suggested that those tasks would be that they do was this idea of communicating to the local community this idea of benefits and risks. And some of the benefits that I asked them, what would those be? It'd be, well, this facility might bring the ability to have broadband access to a community that doesn't have it, or an improving of roads, or be able to fund new schools, or research and development. Those were just some brainstormed ideas that were thrown out. But that entity would be responsible for communicating some of those, as well as the risks involved in that as well. They would be seen as trustworthy and credible and knowledgeable and accountable, that they would partner with elected officials to hold town hall meetings, to ensure that the public was informed, to really be able to work at that state and local level to ensure that a site selection process was certainly fair and equitable and had that community well-being in mind. So that was, as the Blue Ribbon Commission reported, that was certainly something that was probably the highest energy topic that was discussed, the creation of that. To go with that, this idea, and I'll jump to the last one that come in the middle, was this idea of this contract issue, that true consent means that there's a contractual agreement that is established at the local level with that entity, but then had state, could be state legislation would be put on top of that to ensure that the commitments that were made in that contract were followed through, because this is a multi-generational issue that as communities change, there needs to be something binding in place that's sustainable. So that was a piece that needed to be worked in the process early on in the consent-based process. And then finally, and I think we've heard this from all of the groups, this idea of a mechanism for community oversight. That there would be something in place, not quite sure what that something would look like, the group, but there would be something that would go through a verification and validation process that the things committed into the contract, and you have said this, Stu, in your group, that we're walking the walk and talking the talk. There's something there to validate that process. And that had the idea and a lot of discussion around community well-being and how this affects everyone in that community. So certainly a group outside DOE to accomplish the executive part of this, the execution phase, but through binding agreements have that local oversight into this, and they felt like those three were a very powerful combination to increase the trust and credibility that lacks today with this nuclear waste issue. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that. So, sitting back and listening to all of this, I come away with sort of 5 kind of themes. We heard a lot about trust. We heard a lot about an inclusive process. We heard a lot about education, but I think education goes multiple ways. It's not just a one-way street. It's sort of a mutual learning thing. And consent and transparency. And those are all sort of whats. Like, this should happen, and this should happen, and this should happen. I get that. I understand that, and I appreciate your thoughts. So just try this and bear with me for the remaining 7 minutes. Put your hat on of this new organization, all right? You are now part of the new organization that's going to be implementing this. Moving from the what you should do to the how you should do question. How would you, collectively, would we behave to earn that trust? How would we be inclusive? What behaviors would we implement to develop that learning, to earn that consent, to be as transparent as we are advocating for? So, we got 6, 7 minutes. We've got 2 microphones here. And if you feel like you want to offer a suggestion more on the verb, not opposed to the noun, but the verb, how we get somewhere, this is an opportunity. We've got senior officials from DOE. We've got a lot of peers in the room here. We've got new friends. We've got lots of new friends on the webinar. Are there issues or areas where you would like to sort of see a little more of the how talked about? And if so, we've got a few minutes here to enable that conversation to take place. And we've got microphones, and we'll see where this goes. Thank you for your patience and your faith. Let's go.
Okay, once again, Chuck Bernhardt. I'm a consultant. I formerly was assisting the community of Carlsbad in getting WIP open. I think you have an immediate challenge and an opportunity to demonstrate the consent-based approach on the reopening of WIP.
Okay, I would just ask you to turn and face the audience, because it's just not me here, it's everybody here.
Okay. I think they have an opportunity to demonstrate the consent-based approach on the reopening of WIP. My own opinion is that the incidences at WIP have cast some doubt upon the DOE, upon the process, upon the diligence that goes into preparing waste to be disposed. And I believe, and I'm in the minority, but I believe it's going to be a battle. When we got WIP open, we had everybody pretty much on the same sheet of paper. The state, the DOE, the policymakers, the community. My sense is there is strain in that system right now. I would say, DOE, put your money where your mouth is. Let's see how you do it on the reopening of WIP and make sure that's done right.
Okay, thank you very much. We've got a comment down here and then one over there.
Mary Olson, Nuclear Information and Resource Service. DOE, you missed the boat. The Blue Ribbon Commission could and should have been a more diverse group. You chose purely nuclear power advocates. You did not include the full range of this conversation. And you still are not doing that in terms of the design that we heard the professor at this table talk about. If you actually want an outcome that is going to hold, you have to include a much broader range of people in the design of the design. And I am not right now going to fill in the blank of what you're designing, because my community is diverse and I represent them, and I can't fill in that blank. When I make my comment, that'll become a little more transparent. But if you, in fact, had included, as Tom Cochran and others urged you to, some of the dissenting community in the Blue Ribbon, we might be having a different meeting today.
All right. Thank you, Mary. We've got time for one or two more. Is there a mic that we can give her?
I'm Karen Patterson from Aiken, and I too am a consultant. Consultants never reinvent the wheel. So I don't really have a how, but I have a place maybe we could start to look. I realize that Sweden and Finland are very different countries from this one, but they are further along in this process than we are. So maybe if we studied what they had done, we would get some good lessons learned that we could work from.
All right. Any final thoughts on the how? If not, we can move into our public comment period. All right. Thank you very much for your input. We appreciate it. That was great. Okay, so now it's 1:45, and we're going to move into our public comment period. I've got 9 people signed up on the public comment sheet. And if you divide the math, we've got half an hour, 9 people. We're looking at about 2.5, 3 minutes per person. We've got Tim in the back, and Tim's got 2 pieces of paper, a yellow one and a red one. The way we've designed this is that the folks who want to give a public comment will come to the front. There's a microphone here for you. You can face the audience, and you've got your 2.5 minutes to make your statements. I've got, in the order that was signed up, Louis Zeller from Blue Ridge, Gary Harris, Susan Corbett, and I'll remind people of their next statements, followed by Steve Nesbitt and Rod McCollum. So we're going to get Louis Zeller to start. Is the mic on for Mr. Zeller? There we go.
Well, the power man came up to our house, said he had some big plans. He'd make us some nuclear power if we would just sell him our land. He said we'd have a bright future. It would be so very safe. Just two things he didn't mention, big bills and nuclear waste. Well, my daddy said not to waste nothing back when we had nothing to waste. That's what they're giving us, nothing. Nothing but nuclear waste. Well, the government man came to see us. He said, we will help you poor slobs. We got us a government program. Going to give everyone jobs. These jobs will last more than a lifetime. Exciting as flying in space. Just two things he didn't mention, big bills and nuclear waste. Well, my daddy said not to waste nothing back when we had nothing to waste. That's what they're giving us, nothing. Nothing but nuclear waste. Well, they started pasting up posters till they run out of paste with slick talk and pictures in color. The wonders of nuclear waste. Well, some of us folks have been wondering, how dumb do they think we can be? If they don't want waste in their backyard, should I let them dump it on me? Well, my daddy said not to waste nothing back when we had nothing to waste. That's what they're giving us, nothing. Nothing but nuclear waste. One more time, my daddy said not to waste nothing back when we had nothing to waste. And that's what they're giving us, nothing. Nothing but nuclear waste. That song was written by a friend of mine in 1986. It was Wells Edelman when we were fighting the Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management and the Crystalline Repository Project. We've been fighting for 32 years. We're not tired. We're not even winded. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zeller. Gary Harris, you got a tough act to follow, my friend.
I yield my 2 minutes.
All right. Okie dokes. Thank you very much. Thanks, Gary. Appreciate that. Susan Corbett from the South Carolina Sierra Club, followed by Steve Nesbitt of Duke.
Thank you all. Susan Corbett. I'm speaking today on behalf of the South Carolina chapter of the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club has long been opposed to nuclear power. We're still opposed to it. We just think in this day and age there's a much better way to generate electricity. And the National Club is in favor of phasing out nuclear power plants as soon as possible and moving to 100% renewable energy. There's numerous roadmaps out there how to do it, and we believe we can do it, and we're working for that. We are opposed to interim storage, generally speaking. We just think dragging this stuff around the country twice at great taxpayer expense is crazy, and not to mention the transportation issues and risks to the public. I'm sure there's a few exceptions where it needs to be moved, and if that's the case, it should be moved to the closest nuclear facility, not dragged across the country. We think we should get busy locating the permanent repository, put all of our efforts into that, and move it at once. Now, fairness. What's fair? Well, let's see. What's fair about all the world's plutonium being dumped in my state, South Carolina? What's fair about the Barnwell nuclear waste dump leaking into the groundwater and the the company that owns it basically denying and refusing to obey the appeals court ruling to clean it up? What's fair about my utility putting a cap of 2% on solar power so that we don't have a true free market electricity in our state? What's fair about leaving this stuff for future generations? I don't think there's anything fair about any of this. So I'd be hard pressed to find anything fair about any of these processes. I certainly think that we do not want to repeat the mistakes of Yucca Mountain. We need to get the world's top geologists in here. That should be the first thing that happens, is to determine where there are formations in this country that actually meet the criteria, not the other way around. We're not going to try and create the criteria once we get in there. That's the first thing that needs to happen. Before you even go to a community, we need to find out what places are geologically stable. Don't have any magma chambers underneath, volcanoes, earthquakes, water tables. We need to decide where those places are. As far as paying communities, if we're going to offer money, that money should go in the very beginning so communities can bring in experts from both sides of the issue to educate their communities. Not just one side of the issue, all sides. As you hear from dissenting voices, health specialists on both sides of the issue, they should truly educate themselves, and they should do it at the Department of Energy's expense, at our taxpayer expense, so they can make a truly informed consent, not one that is industry biased. And also, there's a lot of other things that will be in our formal comments, but we also are very concerned about the issue of dry cast canisters. At the Fukushima event, the spent fuel was in very robust, thick-walled canister systems. I think it was an Areva system maybe, or a German system. And it did not contribute to the accident. But in this country, we have gone to a thin-walled, cheaper version, only 1/2 inch to 5/8 inch stainless steel cast. And we are very worried. The NRC has not proven that they cannot crack. They may crack, they may leak, and we think that that's an issue that must be addressed immediately before we go any further with talking about dry cast storage. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Susan. Steve Nesbitt from Duke, and then Rod McCollum from NEI, followed by Chuck Bernard.
Thanks for the opportunity to make some comments. I want to start by agreeing with Susan that the country needs to establish a geologic repository for used fuel and high-level waste. First and foremost, the government needs to follow the existing law and continue the Yucca Mountain licensing process. That's a facility that has been evaluated by an independent safety authority and found to be safe and capable of containing used nuclear fuel and radioactive waste for 1 million years. Also, by doing so, it will establish the credibility that it needs to go forward in the siting of, and the commissioning of other radioactive waste management facilities. Because without that, how can you believe the government's going to follow through with the consent-based siting process and actually do what it says it's going to do? Second, we need a dedicated management entity for used fuel and radioactive waste management. A lot of people talked about that, and I'm not going to say anything further. I think it's all been said. Third, we need clear and understandable safety and environmental standards. Those are actually well in place for consolidated storage facilities. The NRC regulations are clear and they make sense. However, for a generic repository, if the government decides it wants to develop another repository in addition to Yucca Mountain, there are no good, usable, understandable generic standards, and the government should take the initiative to establish them. Fourth, in a consent-based siting process, I think the government needs to make a clear statement to the public on what it's looking for so that people have an understanding of what they're being asked, what are the costs, what are the benefits, and then can have a reasonable dialogue. And lastly, I want to say that whatever process is followed, I think it should not preclude those companies and localities and states that come forward to volunteer to site facilities, whether they be consolidated storage facilities or repositories, whether they be in Texas, New Mexico, Nevada, or elsewhere. that those kind of efforts should be encouraged. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Rod?
Thank you. I'm Rod McCollum of the Nuclear Energy Institute. We've already been referred to here. We are the trade association of the commercial nuclear industry in this country. A lot of what I would have said, I think, has already come out in these flip charts you see around here. I just want to take this moment to emphasize one thing that is very important to us, and it's good to see you all participating because this issue is very important to us as an industry. But the notion is of earned consent. It's our experience, having operated over 100 nuclear plants for over 40 years in this country and lots of other nuclear facilities, consent is not a political arrangement. It's not something that can be just simply given. It's not a piece of paper signed by people who may or may not be reelected. Consent is something you have to earn. We do that at our facilities every day. It's in how we are safe. It is in our safety culture. It is the way we are citizens of our communities. You know, it's been talked about how areas around nuclear plants have such great schools, and there's a reason for that. So if there is to be any process that is to be successful in achieving consent, it has to be a process that earns consent. It can't be consent on paper, even brightly colored paper with lots of markers on it. And how do you get to that? Well, it's going to take time, and one might argue with DOE's history, it's going to be hard. You know, that's why I think you see a lot of the calls for a new organization, and we support a new organization. But whether it's DOE or a new organization, you have to ask yourself one question. Given everything that goes into earning consent and how hard that's going to be, do you really want to go back and start again from square one? We have a process in Nevada for Yucca Mountain. That was a process that was very public, involved the communities and the states. Nye County is here because they consent. They consent because they were able to do their own independent scientific research, the Nye County Early Warning Drilling Program, funded by DOE. Now, the state of Nevada has not consented. The state of Nevada has filed over 200 contentions in an existing licensing process. Here's the opportunity to earn consent there. DOE could fight those contentions. Well, right now they're pretending the process doesn't exist. That certainly doesn't earn consent. But DOE could simply fight those contentions. They would earn no consent. There was a facility called PFS in Utah where, you know, the applicant did prevail over the state, and, you know, guess what? They still didn't get to build that facility. But if DOE engages in good faith negotiation over those contentions, if some of Nevada's concerns translate into R&D programs that address Nevada's questions, that turn Nevada's universities and other institutions into centers of excellence, now you're beginning to earn trust. I would tell you, having been involved in many nuclear licensing processes, and these involve the communities and the states and the other agencies, nuclear NRC's licensing processes, because there's that adjudicatory phase, there's an opportunity to intervene and be heard in court. They lend themselves to consent. And I would say don't throw out the 3 processes already underway. Finish the Yucca Mountain licensing process. Either you will earn consent by doing that if you negotiate in good faith, or you will not. If you don't, yeah, you should be looking at other things too. But also realize there's 2 other interim facilities that have been mentioned in Texas and New Mexico. They're also in licensing processes. There's one of those, both of them have had experiences with earned consent. Now, New Mexico has been tested. How they respond to those accidents will test as to whether they still have consent there or not. WCS in Texas has disposed of a lot of material safely. They've been good citizens of that community. They provided economic opportunity for that state. So there's places out there, all 3 places, you have a certain amount of consent equity already. You may have to be looking at some square one options here. We understand that. In fact, that gives you credibility because you're telling the people in Texas, New Mexico, and Nevada that, hey, if we can't earn your consent, you're not still the only thing on the table. That really lends credibility to it. But I would just urge DOE to get that notion of earned consent into everything you do, and let's not go back to square one unless we absolutely have to, because, you know, I'm working with shutdown plants now, and there's a lot of communities that aren't consenting to be nuclear waste storage facilities right now, and those communities are going to have a bigger and bigger voice as more plants shut down, and there's more plants scheduled to be shut down. So really focus on earned consent. I hope we can talk about that more.
Thank you, Rod.
www.nei.org.
Okay, we've got Chuck Bernard, followed by David Blee, then Charles Utley, and we're going to wrap it up with Mary Olson.
Well, thank you for this opportunity to participate and be part of this public hearing. I have to just say off the top of my head, I agree with my friend from NEI on a lot of the things he said, especially about earning consent. My background, once again, is I was the manager of the Department of Development in Carlsbad, New Mexico from 1987 to 1993, really part of a group that had to go get an act of Congress to enable WIP to open. It was called the Land Withdrawal Act of 1992. And so I got to see a lot of the actors involved in this process, and I was like Forrest Gump. I just happened to be at the right place, the right time, and really got to see how this is all done. Also, prior to that, I was the vice president of the Chamber of Commerce in Odessa and got to see WCS in its early days. So I think I speak from a little bit of experience, and I actually wrote a paper on this that I hope would be beneficial to our industry as we go about this. And it was published, I guess, a few months ago by the Waste Management Symposium in their proceedings for 2015. And it was about how we go about siting facilities in the future. And just for your edification, I like to reduce things to a simple formula. I call this the 4 Ps of siting a facility like this. First is a place. Obviously, you got to have a place. And per our earlier discussion, I think it should be a volunteer place. I don't think this, just realistically, this type of activity cannot be forced on a community. It just ain't going to happen. And I think we have an example in North Dakota recently where Rugby, North Dakota, and Dawson County up there all of a sudden found out, oh, well, we're going to have a demonstration site for nuclear waste. And the DOE had to go backwards on it and now looking for a different site. Second P, process. Place, process. We need to define process, and I think we've come a long ways today on defining the elements of that process. Package. Third P. Package is the package of incentives. What can a community expect? Do we have faith that the government's going to carry through on that package? And I think that needs to be independently monitored, just like the safety of the site. Finally, the hardest part, as we all know, is political alignment. How do we get others aligned around this goal? Not easy. I mean, we've done things that are much more innocuous, like the super collider. Well, what happened to that? We can think of a lot of projects like that just we couldn't come together on. So those are just some items for you. The paper's going to be available if you'd like, and I thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Charles. David Blee, Charles Utley, and then Mary Olson.
Sure. Well, thank you, everyone, for participating today, and we appreciate the invitation to be here. I represent the U.S. Nuclear Infrastructure Council. We're focused on new nuclear and the involvement of the supply chain internationally. As such, we're very focused on the resolution of the back end of the fuel cycle, which is critical to the future, certainly, of new nuclear and the sustainability of the supply chain. Just like to focus on a few general observations that I think we're missing from today's handout and discussion. I think one is, to put this in perspective, over 50 years of nuclear energy generation, really nearly 60, you arguably could fit all the spent fuel on 100 acres. So this is not a high volume in terms of the magnitude of the issue. In terms of transportation, it would take about 1 shipment a week to transport this stuff to a central repository. And that's out of 3 million hazardous waste shipments a year. With respect to the experience of safely stored in the U.S. outside the reactor since the mid-1980s, already around the world, more fuel has been transported than is currently actually sitting in pools or outside plants in the U.S. So the transportation experience without harm to the public has been carried out safely, so the track record is great there. The other thing is we hear a lot, certainly in the song, about waste, it being a waste. It's actually a resource, potentially. If you see a doubling of the world nuclear fleet to 800 reactors, as along with the Chinese, what the growth in Asia, what will be needed here in the U.S. to meet our clean energy goals, you're looking at the potential of recycling. You could actually be sitting on a resource in these communities where right now in the U.S., in the spent fuel, there is enough, if it was recycled, to power the nuclear fleet for another 10 to 20 years. So again, this is not necessarily a waste, it's a resource. I also would look at in terms of the timeline here, that is, the history of nuclear waste management is missing a couple of things. One is, since in the 2010 to 2015 period, as we mentioned, the NRC has found that spent fuel could be stored at Yucca Mountain for 1 million years. They have adopted their safety evaluation reports. I think that's worth noting. They're near completion of an environmental impact statement, and I think they're about ready to deal with the contentions. You've heard today that 3 communities have come forward and said they would consent to, or are close to consent, or putting an application into either interim or a repository. And then there have been votes in the Congress, roughly 300 to 100 repeatedly, to put money into this program and move forward. So I think those are important to remember, that this hasn't all been in a vacuum in the last 5 years. That said, we think it's urgent and imperative to move forward. This is critical to the environment. Nuclear energy provides 60% of our carbon-free electricity. It's critical to our global competitiveness, hundreds of thousands of jobs, and it's also key to U.S. energy security, and very critically important to U.S. nonproliferation efforts internationally. So, great to see some positive momentum here, and we look forward to working with you to resolve this issue.
Thank you, David. Charles Utley, and then Mary Olson.
Good afternoon. I know it's getting late in the afternoon, and I'm about ready to go, as I know you are too, because they always tell me you can't consume or can't take in no more than that large muscle you're sitting on. And I know you've been on it quite a while. So I'm going to be very brief in what I've got to say. And that is because I live it. I live it every day. I'm down in Burke County, Waynesboro, Georgia, where you'll find people who are not vocal because they are afraid. And this consent must consider those type people, because it's in their back door. They know that they'll get a phone call saying, why did you show up at the meeting? Well, my boss, I don't have to report to him, because my boss is not them. And therefore, I want to speak on their behalf, because it's an imperative that you understand that they don't have what you think everyone else has. And I heard someone say earlier, there's still a digital divide. You know, I'm a pastor down in the community, and a lot of my parishioners, they don't have cable, and they don't have satellite. Only satellite they got is my big mouth on Sunday morning. But the other thing we must realize is that there is this group of people who are afraid when it comes to letting the government do anything for them. And you have to realize that they depend on the parishioners, looking to the pastors, looking for the elected officials, looking to DOE. And when they get disappointed on those levels, trust is gone. So we must build in transparency. We must invite them in, and we must take it to a level where they can understand it. Don't go in there trying to tell them how to plant beans now. You need to go in there and tell them what you're talking about when you're talking about parts per billion, because they have no idea what you're talking about with parts per billion. Break it down to them so they can participate in these type of discussions, and then we'll have a consent of the people and not from the government driven down. Because if you get it from the government driven down, you would learn it like I did. My parents told me, don't go by Savannah River site, don't drive through it, because it's government property, you're going to be killed, and there's nothing we're going to be able to do about it. That was what I was taught. It was the bum plant. It was nothing but the bum plant. So therefore, I'm saying to each of you, as we make these plans, as we go forward with them, and be inclusive, invite those who are able to participate. But whatever you do, make the legislation if you're making it in your own backyard. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. And our final public comment will be Mary Olson.
My name is Mary Olson. I'm with Nuclear Information and Resource Service. We work for a non-nuclear energy policy, and I'm actually beginning to say a non-nuclear climate policy as well. I have been serving personally communities that have been subject to forced siting for the last 25 years. And I am interested and open to the idea that there's another way to do this. I don't feel like we're there yet, in part because my community actually shifted gears probably 10, 15 years ago now. When I first got my job, what we'd say is, stop making this waste. We still say that. Stop making this waste. If you have a hole, stop digging. But about 15 years ago, we started with some positive advocacy of steps we support. And we do not get heard. We present them over and over and over and over, and we continue to not be heard. So I'm going to try it one more time. And these are opportunities to work together, honestly. Our first question is the waste leaking now? If the waste is leaking now, let's do something about that. From our perspective, fuel pools are leaking in many locations, and a fire would mean massive leaking. So we would like to unload those pools ASAP. Now we hear there's problems with the containers. So we want to say, let's get the best containers we can, and let's work together to figure out how to ensure that they can be inspected, that there are ways to mitigate problems, that the steps that we have outlined in a document called HOS, or Hardened On-Site Storage, also called the Principles for Safeguarding Nuclear Waste at Reactor Sites. There's about 6 points in that document. I didn't actually manage to get it in my hand, but one of the keys is that the waste be hardened once it's in dry storage, that it be monitored in real time, that there be community oversight, and that interim storage is happening today and it continue at the reactor sites. Get that? HOS means hardened on-site storage, not consolidated storage. So then the next issue is, yeah, this stuff does have to be moved, but we'd like to see it moved once. To where or for what purpose? We're ready to hear that conversation. I need to correct from my perspective or add to the record on Yucca Mountain, because the Department of Energy does not say it can meet the million-year standard. It says it can meet the million-year standard at Yucca Mountain if, after the repository is closed, titanium drip shields are put in by robots. That is the only way that site would meet that million-year standard. And I defy this room to stand up and say they know how that would A, be done, or B, how it would be paid for. So finally, I want to say that we need information at all levels. And clearly, one last piece that many of you do not know or understand is that biologically we are different based on gender. And every single step of this nuclear process is impacting females on this planet to a much greater degree than males. And until you get down in the weeds of that level of impact, how the hell can you say we can consent? Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you all to the commenters. We're on the home stretch now, so we're wrapping things up. I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Andrew Griffith, the Associate Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fuel Cycle Technologies, to offer his closing remarks.
Thank you, Jim. And on behalf of Secretary Moniz, John Kotek, and the entire consent-based siting team, I want to thank you all for your participation today. The inputs you've provided us have been exactly what we've been looking for. We recognize we don't have a fan club here. You could think that we might be disappointed by or discouraged by some of the comments we've received, but actually I think we're encouraged. What we believe we have ahead of us is a way of developing a process that's going to be enduring. It's going to provide a durable solution to a very, very challenging problem. You've discussed it, I think, in a lot of detail today. We believe the solution lies in having an integrated waste management system that includes interim storage, as well as ultimately the objective is disposal. We believe that's the way of isolating this waste from the humans and protecting future generations. And we believe the technology exists today that can do that in a way that protects the workers, the public, and the environment. We just have to be responsible in executing. We heard today that there are some key things that we need to consider going forward, including the administration strategy about forming a separate entity to oversee and manage this effort. We're totally on board with that. The challenge is getting there, getting to that point, because it does require legislation from Congress. It does require actions outside of our control. But we believe it's so important that we have to get started today. We can't wait for that other entity to form. And so we're doing that, embracing those values that you shared with us today and that we've heard elsewhere, including the trust issue. We get it. We have to earn your trust, no question about it, absolutely essential. And so we're working every day to do that. We have to be transparent. We have to follow through on our commitments, and we have to get it right. And so with that, I'm personally encouraged. I think the whole team is behind this effort. We're embracing these values. We want to go forward. We know we got a tough job out there, but I think we're up to it, and with your help, I think we'll get there. So thank you very much. That's all I have. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, panel members. Thank you, audience, both here in Atlanta and on the webinar. Thank you, logistics team. Personally, I'm grateful for all your participation and your hard work reflected by the flip charts and your thinking, and it means a great deal. Don't forget to pass in your completed evaluation forms. We use these to make subsequent meetings more effective. This wraps up the formal part of the meeting, and the webinar will now close. For those who wish to join the poster sessions in the back, please do so. We invite you now. Thank you again. We are adjourned. Have a good evening. Safe travels.